So the final formal presentation for CEF Group 2022 is now coming online. So we have Professor Emeritus Naoyuki Yoshino, who is based at Keio University in Tokyo. And are you there, Professor?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me today. I hope my PowerPoints be available to see. Can you see my PowerPoints?
You can see your PowerPoint. Looks great. Thank you so much. So please, when you're ready to begin, we're waiting.
Thank you. Today, I'm focusing on several issues. One is ESG investment and green investment. And my work is a little bit more finance and performance oriented. Traditionally, investors looked at rate of return and risk. And now investors have to pay attention to ESG or greenness score. And previous paper and my paper is going to talk about the ESG rating or greenness rating. It is different from one agency to another. And also greenness score published by ICMA in France has also diversified definition. So first I'm going to show these differentiated definitions will bring distorted portfolio allocation. And then what could be the best way to bring back to optimal portfolio allocation is the taxation on greenhouse gas. And also last 2 points, I'm going to talk about the central bank's purchase of green bond that may bring some macroeconomic distortion. And lastly, I'll talk about small businesses versus large businesses. As was pointed out already, here I picked up 5 rating agencies. And on the right-hand side, you'll be able to see red line where how each rating agency define the ESG score, especially focusing on environmental score. Some of the rating agency looked at companies' ESG efforts. So they interview the people of the company and then they score the E. And another rating agency looked at the disclosure booklet. How many pages the disclosure booklet talks about environmental issues. And another rating agency looked at whether the company has ESG policy or not by interviewing senior staff. So depending on the rating agency, environmental scores are so different one to another. And this is the example of the Japanese company, Company A and Company B. Company A is electric power company, and Company B is apparel company. Then rating agency X, column 1, rating agency Y, column 2. You'll see diversified number scores. They are all different. And furthermore, the degree of Company A and Company B, orders are different depending on rating agency X and Y, because they are focusing on different factors to evaluate environmental scores. And traditionally, investors looked at rate of return and risk. And now investors has to pay attention to ESG score in addition to this R and sigma. And traditional portfolio analysis looked at the 2 frontier line, black line of AB, and maximize utility based on rate of return and risk. And there are many different kinds of utility formulation, but this is one of the simplest way. However, now investors has to take into account of ESG score or greenness score as a third independent item, rate of return and risk and ESG. Then the optimal portfolio allocation is shown on the last equation. Alpha T is the portfolio allocation between company A and company B. Then you can see on the last term, ESG-A minus ESG-B. So ESG scores are important to determine the allocation of portfolio assets. If I draw a diagram, traditionally rate of return and risk are evaluated in the horizontal axis, and point E was chosen as an optimal point by investors. Nowadays, investors have to pay attention to ESG score as a vertical axis, either ESG score or greenness score as a vertical axis. Then line AB is the evaluation of ESG score by each rating agency. Then the optimal point becomes point F. And if you bring it back down to the horizontal axis, then point F is different from point E. And realistically, there are a couple of rating agencies, and some rating agency on the vertical axis, large line, black line of AB is their score. And green line A dash, B dash, this is another rating agency, their ESG score. As we have seen, each agency has different criteria, so their evaluation of the third axis are different from one to another. Then if we bring down those optimal points into the horizontal sphere, then some rating agency suggest point F, red line, is the optimal portfolio allocation. And another rating agency suggests point G is better for their allocation. Many investors, not only in Japan, but also all over the world, pick up one rating agency as a consultant, and then they receive advice how they should reallocate their portfolio from traditional rate of return risk, but also taking into account of environmental issues. Then the rating agency, some rating agency suggest you should reallocate to point F. Another will suggest to point G. And this is a simple empirical results. And there are 4 columns. And again, company A is electric power company in Japan. And company B is apparel company in Japan. And there are 3 rating agencies. As an example, I picked up Robeco-Sam, Sustainalytics, and Bloomberg. Then evaluation of ESG score, if you can see horizontally, scores are so different from one to another, even for the company B. Then if I compute optimal portfolio allocation, then alpha, the first column is the point where nothing to be focused on environmental score. So if rating agents, if investors only look at rate of return and risk traditionally, then 0.57 was the optimal allocation. 57% should be allocated to company A, and 43% should be allocated to company B. This was the traditional allocation. But depending on rating agency, Robeco-Sam, Sustainalytics, Bloomberg, then last row 0.71, 0.74, 0.54. Each rating agency will advise different ratios of 2 investment. So those are the empirical analysis, how these rating agency provide different portfolio ratio to one company to another. And another model I tried is the rating and risks are directly affected ESG score or greenness score. The same thing can be applied, and we'll get the portfolio allocation will be different depending on the scores of ESG or greenness scores. Next, I have looked at the relation between ESG score and stock price. because ESG scores are defined differently from one rating agency to another, one can imagine their correlations are not necessarily be unique. When I picked up one rating agency in the middle, in that case, ESG score, especially environmental score and stock prices are parallel and correlated. But if I pick up another rating agency, their scores are based on different definition. As you can see, stock price and environmental scores have not related at all. Then what would be the best way to bring these distorted allocation into the optimal portfolio allocation? One way is taxing on CO2 or greenhouse gases. Then investors can pay attention to after-tax rate of return and after-tax risks without paying attention to environmental score or greenness score, because taxation will automatically reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. And this is our simple result. Equation 16 and equation 17 is after-tax rate of return. TA is the tax rate multiplied by, for example, CO2 emission, and TB is tax rate times company B's CO2 emission. And then we can also compute risks coming from these after-tax rate of return and after-tax measures. Then on the right-hand side, red dotted line will become the new frontier of the company A and company B. These are after-tax and greenhouse gas exposures has been taxed, and their measure has been already taken into account. And exposed rate of return after tax will be shown at the red line, and point T will become the optimal point, which will be shifted from point E. Next is whether could we measure CO2 emission. Currently, satellite technology is possible to measure the temperature of each household, each factory, and large businesses and building. Of course, it is very costly. This is one photo taken on the island of Japan. And then this can theoretically measure how much heat each household is using, how much temperature heat SMEs are producing. So those kind of measurement will be possible to measure CO2. And this way, if tax rate is levied to each company, the same tax rate, and hopefully internationally the same tax rate, then exposed and after-tax rate of return and after-tax risks will become much easier. And companies, investors do not have to pay attention to how much greenhouse gas they are exposing, and they don't have to rely on different definition of rating agency. Another way is a unified green rating. Either United Nations or ADB or international organization can set up unified green rating based on CO2 emission, NOx emission, plastics emission, and so on. And if the unified green rating is being announced, then investors can refer to that unified green rating, and then they can allocate their portfolio depending on this unified green rating. In implementing the taxation on real world, it will be also advisable to tax on net emission. Net emission, number one, carbon emission minus greenness efforts, such as planting trees in the forestry or preserving seaweed. By the way, seaweed is very good to absorb CO2 in the ocean. So the conservation of seaweed is also another important thing. And if these greenness efforts can be deducted from gross carbon emission, companies will work hard to invest into planting trees, forest preservation, seaweed planting, and so on. That can encourage the reduction of CO2 much more. And number two, in actual policy implementation, emerging economies and SMEs, as I have pointed out in my previous comment, 50% of CO2 emission comes from small and medium-sized enterprises. However, they are not affordable to pay tax on these CO2 emission. Then gradual increase of tax rate to SMEs and the emerging economies may be advisable. Next, I would like to talk about green bond. 2018 in June, green bond principles were announced by International Capital Market Association in Paris. And recently, another taxonomy was issued. And these are green bond. There are 5 criteria. If renewable energy is constructed, or energy efficient building or energy efficient housing is constructed, then they can issue green bond. And there are two items where green bond can be issued. And in Japan, there are lots of green bonds have been issued by new energy efficient building. So I interviewed to those new building, how much CO2 has been reduced with that building. But the answer is we don't know how much. But we are sure this new building is much more energy efficient because elevator is less energy use and rooms are much more ventilation and so on. So definitely they are much more energy efficient. However, some of the building is 20% CO2 cut and another building is 35% CO2 cut. Both of them can issue green bond and there is no differentiation in their rating. So as long as these 10 criteria, one of the criteria is satisfied, green bond can be issued. However, they are not accurate measurement of the amount of greenhouse gas reduction. So the same point can be applied to greenness measure. And this will distort the optimal portfolio allocation because investors do not know each green bond, how much greenhouse gas reduction is achieved. And there are many different kinds of green bond have been issued without accurating rated one to another. Lastly, I would like to touch upon 2 points. First one is central bank purchase of green bond. And this, my view, is different from the keynote speaker of Ulrich Bolz and also Britain. There are 2 ways to think about the central bank. One is left-hand side, another is right-hand side. Traditional central bank was right-hand side. They purchased ordinary government bond, and then they supplied money. This was the traditional central banking. However, in Britain, central bank started to purchase green bond on the left-hand side. And then this causes distortion of fiscal allocation that I'm going to explain. If we look at the bottom, fiscal policy or politics will determine how government spending should be allocated. Education, infrastructure, green sector, these allocations were decided by fiscal policy. And fiscal policy, Ministry of Finance issue ordinary government bond. And this bond were purchased by central bank on the right-hand side. So central bank is neutral against about the allocation of budget. But if left-hand side, central bank purchases certain amount of green bond as an encouragement of their greenness effort, that means central bank are changing the fiscal allocation of to green sector, depending on the amount, how much central bank purchases green bond. And this week I was in the Philippines. I discussed this point with the governor and deputy governor of the Central Bank of the Philippines. Then the deputy governor told me, Central Bank of the Philippines is going to the left-hand side. However, the purchase of the green bond would be very small, but they would like to advertise a lot. The central bank is also concerned about greenness efforts. But probably Central Bank of the Philippines will keep on the right-hand side most of the time, but only small portion could purchase green bond. And also the left-hand side problem is green bond. Some of the green bond is 20% CO2 cut, and another green bond is 35% CO2 cut. Both of them are identically called green bond. That will also distort the portfolio allocation. So this is the summary of the fiscal and monetary policy. Fiscal policy determines the allocation of money, and central bank will purchase ordinary government bond and let the fiscal policy determine their allocation of asset money. And last point is about SME, small and medium-sized enterprises. Large businesses issue stocks and corporate bonds, so there are pressure from investors. However, micro SME, small and medium-sized enterprises, they rely on informal market or banks, and they don't issue stocks or bonds. So they are not receiving any pressure from investors. Furthermore, small and medium-sized enterprises do not have their extra money to spend the reduction of CO2. So OECD study says more than 50% of CO2 emissions come from small and medium-sized enterprises. So small amount of tax is charged to SME for those CO2 emissions, then SMEs will become to realize the importance of the reduction of CO2. And gradually, those tax rates could be increased. So that's all my presentation. Thank you very much for inviting today.
All right, thanks so much.